Have you ever lost your voice? I'm not talking about laryngitis here or the after effects of a particularly raucous karaoke night. I'm talking about that shrinking feeling when you lose all sense of who you are, your confidence, your way in the world. Well, I have, my friend. I think it's been a cocktail of a few things over the years. An exhausting, but not exhaustive combo of the shifting sands of identity, early motherhood, the ravaging of the beast that is perimenopause, social anxiety, masking, burnout, and let's not even mention the pandemic. I have become obsessed with this whole idea of finding your voice and what it means creatively, personally, and collectively when we find it. I want to understand how you find it, and if you've lost it, how do you get it back? Join me as I talk to fascinating people who have found their voices and aren't afraid to use them. People who have found their purpose, their passion, and fearless, authentic expression. I'm talking about writers, activists, artists, thinkers, entrepreneurs. We're going to get into their work and their life stories. How did they do it? What were the turning points? What barriers did they overcome? How did they find the courage? And what tips and tricks do they have to navigate this business of becoming? I'm looking to reclaim my voice, yes, and to get my mojo back, but it's more than that. I want to understand this topic and look at it from all angles: historical, cultural, societal, biological, mythical, even mystical. And most of all, through a female lens. Let's not beat about the bush, it's mostly women I'll be speaking to, with the occasional brilliant man thrown in. But these conversations are for anyone who resonates with the quest. Everybody's welcome. Hi, my name is Jessie. I'm a writer by trade, a novelist by aspiration. I do not have the answers, not yet. I'm not a certified coach with patented life theories or a high-flying CEO with productivity hacks. I am no guru, but what I am is endlessly curious about other people and their stories. I've programmed and run a literary and storytelling event series for over a decade now, so I know firsthand the power that stories have to inspire and transform, and that's what we're here for. So, if you want to find your voice or to be inspired, if you're in a liminal state, a similar boat, if you just really like books or want to feast on the sweeping stories of amazing people's life and work, then this podcast might be for you. Please follow, subscribe, and join me on this voyage into voice. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find ours along the way. Hello, welcome to How You Find Your Voice. In this episode, I'm joined by the wonderful Sally Magnusson MBE, novelist, journalist, and broadcaster whose latest book, The Shapeshifter's Daughter, reimagines the Norse mythological figure of hell of the underworld. We talk about mythology, feminist retellings, and why the Norse goddesses deserve their time in the limelight. We delve into memory, imagination, and the threads that run through Sally's work, from a childhood steeped in storytelling to embracing both the light and the dark. I hope you enjoy it. I think it's an amazing book. I love the mythological themes. I was actually born in Norway. Yeah, my father, he speaks fluent Norwegian. At home, we had this big tome of the Snorri, and I remember he used to read or try and translate the tales because it was kind of in the original. Well, not the original, but it was in Norwegian.
Wonderful. There's nothing quite like these tales. It's very, very different sort of cultural feel from the Greek myths, for instance. These northern ones that are always inhabited by creatures of winter. You know, I love it.
What drew you to the mythological story and the figure of hell of the underworld? Was that the way in, or was it the character of Helen Firth? Because we have them both kind of their strands and their stories interweaving in this book. What first drew you?
It was hell first, and it's because I found myself wanting to write about the Norse myths. I've so enjoyed what novelists, mainly female novelists, actually have been doing with the Greek myths. Bringing them to life and investing them with character and motivation, often rather different from the old stories. And I thought, why has nobody done this with the Norse myths? And then when I grew up with the Norse myths, I knew them fairly well. But when I actually started to look into them with a view to maybe writing about them, I realized how thin on the ground strong, interesting female characters were. Now, Odin and Thor and Loki are well known actually to a certain generation now through Marvel comics, through video games and so on. But there's, the female goddesses hadn't really surfaced at all. And when I went back to the sources, I realized why. They're nearly always somebody's wife, and there's always sort of things happening to them, and they're all very sort of golden and beautiful. But there was this one character that fascinated me, and she was the daughter of Loki, one of the three monstrous children of Loki who were cancelled, neutralized by Odin because he was worried. Odin's the leader of the gods. He was worried that his dreams were telling him that one day the children of Loki would be responsible for the destruction of the gods. So he threw the serpent into the sea. He chained up the wolf for all time, and he threw Hel, the third sister, into the great abyss which led to the underworld, and sent her there to rule over the dead, which he thought she would be extremely well qualified to do because she was looked half like a corpse herself. She was very beautiful, one side of her face, and the other side was so kind of decrepit and decomposed looking that it is described often as a corpse. And this character was then affected in its depiction by medieval Christianity. Snorri Sturluson, the great Icelandic writer of the Middle Ages, which were then Christian, was retelling these tales which came from a pre-Christian era. And he wrote them in such a way that he was making accommodations to the Christian worldview all the time. And that's what then Hel, the Norse Hel, began to be sort of identified in the mind as the hell of the underworld.
And presumably that's where we get the word hell as well. It must be the kind of origin, or is it?
Well, nobody has quite worked it out yet, because it goes right back to Indo-European, this word hell, and it sort of means hidden. And you never know what has come first, what has influenced what, but it's certainly connected there in some way. And I just thought this woman is interesting, but she has been entirely caricatured in the myth, and used as, of course, this is the entire purpose of myth, is to dramatize the human condition, the fears and the hopes and the worries of what it means to be human, and all our human fears about death, the horror of death, the fear of death, the desperate desire to divide up, those who pass death's way into the good and the bad, so that there's at least a feeling that people get their deserts. So Hell of the Underworld was in charge of the worthless dead, while great heroes would go to Valhalla. All these things are the reason that people make their stories. They make stories in order to dramatize who they are. And what makes myth live for the ages is that it is reinterpreted in the ages, so that the books that I was reading when I was younger about the Norse myths, and one of them was very similar to the one that Helen is reading in the library in Orkney as a child. These were written by and large by Victorians who are bringing a Victorian worldview to hell, and hell, of course, hideous hell, anarchic hell, fits very nicely into what they want to say is very bad. So I thought, well, it's time it's time for a new assessment of hell. And what I'll do, I thought, reading, because there's not an awful lot written about her in the sources, which actually is helpful to a novelist. You don't want
You
too
don't want
much
too much,
detail.
yeah.
Yeah,
Some
you want
license.
enough to be able to imagine into, because you don't want to get the details wrong that are there, but you want to look at them a different way. And I thought, if I do it from inside Hell's head, what is it like to be led before Odin and then find yourself in charge of the dead and the underworld, and see what happens to your siblings, and have a father like Loki, and all these things. And so I worked with that. And then I was hugely interested to find that an older Germanic telling of the story of hell actually had her not as a harbinger of death, a hideous, horrible, terrifying creature, but as somebody who was almost like a midwife of death, somebody there to bring you into new birth and new life. So the book became about Hell trying to find out who she is, and then the events in modern Orkney, her kind of alter ego, Helen Firth, who learned all about hell by reading about her early on, and almost deliberately embodied her when life became very hard for her. These two things can come together in a modern exploration of death and our feelings about death and aging and so on.
It sounds like it was a very intentional, conscious choice. I'm assuming you were kind of inspired by people like Madeline Miller or Pat Barker, perhaps, or Natalie Haynes. I love a
Yeah.
classical retelling, but a mythological retelling, and which is also why I loved this book. And I think that you do such a good job of really showing a different side to hell. I mean, maybe she's not a goddess that people are so familiar with, but I was incredibly moved about the whole kind of earth goddess sort of strand that you bring out so cleverly from the beginning, where you see what her kind of natural inclinations are towards kind of like feeling the earth and sort of healing. And then it's like through her mistreatment, essentially by the patriarchy, if you like, that
Yeah.
she kind of becomes this almost caricature of herself.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Circe by Madeline Miller was such an awakening for me as to what could be done with a myth, while still remaining true to the sources, but just absolutely investing it with imagination. And although there's no attempt to bring Circe into the modern world, and that's maybe the extra bit that I'm adding here, um, to read somebody who can write so beautifully and make you feel as if you are literally in a different world, and you suspend your disbelief, you leave it at the front door, and you're in there. And I suppose that's what my aspiration was.
Yes, and giving her voice, essentially allowing her to tell her own story. Um, Memory seems to be an important theme in this book as well. You obviously write so beautifully about memory and your journey with caring for your mother's dementia and where memories go. This book to me seems to be an act of remembering in many ways. It's kind of the catalyst for the story unfolding is Hal having a kind of a glimpse of a memory, and Helen Firth, who has a terminal cancer diagnosis, she returns to her home, and it's kind of all an act of remembering. What resonance does memory and the theme of remembering have for you? Why do you think it's something you keep returning to?
It's interesting. I've never posed myself that question, but it may be something to do with actually the age I am, and coming to novel writing quite late in my 60s, I'm horrified to say, at which what you can bring, I think, to your art, whatever it is a lifetime's experience. And you know what it is to be young. You actually know what it is for what was seminal when you were young, whether that is happiness or trauma, you can you know what it's like to be at the other end or even just the middle of life and have that still resonating within you. That I think is what the older novelist can uniquely bring, actually. And that I think this is such an interesting question, because I'm just thinking about this as I speak. But that is why memory, I think, is so important to me. And also because, say, I wrote a book about the experience of dementia that my mother had, and where I watched, it's called Where Memories Go. I watched memory leaving her, along with personality and functionality and so on, and thought very deeply and intensively at that time about what memory is and how it furnishes your mind and what it is to lose it. So I suppose all my novels, actually, because the novels all came after that book Where Memories Go, which was it was a memoir, a campaigning memoir, but written in a somewhat novelistic style. All these novels have dealt with memory in some form, not just personal memory, but cultural memory, about the importance of story. The Sea Woman's Gift, my debut novel, was about the true story of Icelanders who were abducted by Algerian pirates and taken back in a galleon in the 17th century to Algiers and sold into slavery. And in my telling of it, the one thing that survived, the one thing that was left to them when everything else went, Austa, the central characters, she lost her children one by one, but what remained was the stories in her head, stories she'd brought up with, kind of mythological stories in a way, folk tales and so on. And each novel since has dealt with that in a different way. And so Music in the Dark actually was a woman in the Highland clearances in the 19th century in Scotland who, had been damaged in the head by a police attack, as often happened when they were trying to clear the people from their houses. And that head damage is affecting her now, 40 years later, and affecting what she can remember and how she remembers and so on. So in all sorts of different ways, I'm just going to go away and think about this. This is so interesting. In all sorts of different ways, memory is what my books are about. Yeah,
seems to be a thread. And I guess myth, what you were saying there, kind of collective memory. I guess myth is kind of the ultimate collective memory, isn't it? Because it's kind of the framework of origin stories, or in how we live our lives. There's a really interesting part in the book where I think that really conveys the power of story, and that's without giving too much away. There is a scene in which knowing the myths and knowing the stories confers kind of an advantage or some sort of power to one of the characters. I thought that was really fascinating. What do you think the power of story is for you as well? What power has kind of storytelling brought you in your life?
It's been absolutely central to my life. I mean, really, when I think about it, and also and story in all sorts of different ways. I'm a journalist by training, and for a long time my writing was journalistic writing, which we always called stories. It was about, I grew up, my parents were journalists, and all the talk in our house was, I've got a good story, I must go and pursue that story. And at the same time, the different kinds of stories were emerging as well. My father was translating Icelandic sagas and telling us all about the characters of Njál and Gunnar and all the names that became as familiar to me as Enid Blyton characters. I was actually reading, and the myths and Thor and these people, and my mother, who had a very different, she was very much embedded in she was a Scottish storytelling tradition. She was somebody who told anecdotes. She had ironically enough, she had a wonderful memory for her youth, for the stories in the war, for her early journalistic exploits. And my head was just full of all that. You don't realize that very much as a child. It's only, and this again is the memory theme again, it's only when decades later you are beginning to, as I have been, open my mind and imagination to other modes of thinking and expression, that you realize that's absolutely core to me all the way through. And the reason I think that I needed to write as I went through life, even when it was improbably hard. I had 5 children in quick succession. Yes, I know you may look astounded, but I did. At one point, I had 5 children under 10. Is my sort of high point. And I was keeping down a job in broadcasting, but I also needed to write, and so I would write about whatever came to hand. And it was I wrote one book about family life, just funny stories. I wrote a couple of kind of potboiler biographies. I got interested in how urine is used to make cloths, and how that became a sort of industrial product in the Middle Ages. All sorts of things that I could just do on the side because I needed to write stuff. And I think that was the kind of central thing about story in my head all these years. And then gradually, when my life got to a point where the children were growing up or grown up, and I had more time to actually focus on the writing, then I was able to become a proper writer, if you like. But story had kind of kept me going. And then, when I got to write the novels, and I know you're interested in the idea of finding your voice as a writer. My voice started to come to me when I was able to set aside the journalistic idea of a story, the factual line behind so much of my nonfiction, and say, for the first time really in my life, I am going to leap off an imaginative tree, if you like, and see if I can fly on the strength of my imagination rather than the strength of my ability to research and write, good journalism.
And how did you do that? How did you, it sounds like it's kind of innate to you, and it was kind of a natural process, and it was like you needed it to happen. But how did you manage to kind of switch? Was it a difficult switch, I guess, from being?
It was a gradual switch. The first one was The Seal Woman's Gift, which, I mean, I only ended up writing this as fiction because my editor was very pleased with how Where Memories Go, the memoir had gone out into the world, and said, "What's your next one? What stories do you want to tell?" And I had been in Iceland, and I had picked up a copy of a memoir which had been translated into English recently by a 17th century Icelandic pastor on the Westman Islands, whose family, he and his family, had been kidnapped from their homes in 1627 by Algerian pirates who had overrun their island, taken them back to Algiers, sold them at the slave market, and his 11-year-old son, Aid, was the very first of this batch to be sold, never saw him again. And his wife, Austa, who became my protagonist because I was very interested in what her experience would be, she went to serve in a maid of some description in a big house there with the 2 youngest children. She'd given birth to one on this slave ship. and Oliver was sent back to Iceland to try and get a ransom. And the story of what happened to that family is the story of that book. So I said to my editor, I'd like to write that story. She said, excellent, wonderful, do that. And then I started to think about it, and I thought, this is a major event in Icelandic history. You don't write lightly about this as history. You need to be an academic, or at the very least, you're going to have to spend weeks and months in libraries and with translators, and probably 6 months in Istanbul as well, trying to get records of what the Ottoman regencies were like in the 17th century. And I said, no, look, I've thought about it. I haven't got time. I don't think, or will, I can't do that. And she said, well, write it as fiction. And I said, oh, I don't write fiction. I don't make things up. I've never had to use my imagination that way before. And she said, try it. And so I did. I wrote a whole draft of The Silverman's Gift, and I got to the end, and I read it, and I thought, am I right in thinking this is slightly boring? And I thought, no, it can't be boring. There's so much in it. I've just lived with it too long. That's it. And then, of course, my editor, very politely and kindly, got back to me and said, yes, Sally, this is a great start, but you need to inhabit these characters. You need you're writing as a documentary. And I realized I was writing for a great historian in Iceland who I had interviewed and had given me all sorts of information, and the early site of his history book and so on. And I realized that was missing. And that's the point. And I was also absolutely flabbergasted to think I was actually going to have to start again. There was no patching up this. It was the wrong approach. And I was at a dinner at which the great novelist Sarah Perry and James Robertson, who's a great novelist in Scotland, were, and they were asking me how I was going for my writing, and I said, I've done a draft. I'm going to have to start again, and feeling very sorry for myself. And it was James who said to me, Sally, how many drafts did you say you've done? I said, oh, one. And he and Sarah just laughed their heads off. I said, come back and complain, James said, when you've done 25.
Okay.
And that's when I realized that this novel writing lark was hard work, and I was either going to do it properly or not at all. So anyway, I started again, and that's when that analogy of jumping off the tree came to me. Because I put aside all my research. I thought, if I need to check anything, the books are there, but I'm just going to write from inside. And I became Austa Thorsteinsdottir. I experienced coming to hot, Muslim Algiers from backward cold Iceland in the 17th century, and I experienced everything through her. And that's when I realized. I realized, actually, do you know what? I think I can do this. I can imagine. I have got an imagination. I've been late in discovering it, but I can do this. And then with every subsequent book, I have probably let myself go more and more, bringing in, because I've always been interested in not pure fantasy, but I'm so imbued with folktale and myth and saga and these stories that I've always liked the idea of blending social realism with stories about things you can't see and have to imagine and don't know if they're there or not, but they might be, because there's more to heaven and earth than we can ever apprehend truly. So that aspect began to take more and more, come more and more to the forefront, I suppose, to the point where in The Shapeshifter's Daughter, half the characters are actually from another world. But I'm still trying to pull off the trick of making the natural world, the human modern world in this case, interact with them in such a way that you don't feel the jolt all the time.
You don't feel the jolt. You manage to blend them kind of, you move between kind of Midgard and Asgard and Niflheim, and between the two realms, but there's a thread that runs through, and you manage to blend both really, really convincingly. And your characterization is, I'd be really interested to kind of hear how you approach characterization, because I think, for example, the story between Thorfinn, and Helen Firth, they're sort of late blossoming. Well, I don't want to give anything away, but they come together and sort of rekindle a relationship, if you can say it's rekindling. The complicated father-daughter dynamic is all really believable. Like, what do you draw on when you're approaching characterization? Is it what you just described sounded a little bit like method writing, if you like, because you just described, you really imagine yourself there. Did they just present themselves to you, or is it like a conscious kind of conjuring?
They evolve a bit in the telling. They started out, I mean, Thorfinn, who becomes very close to Helen in the course of the book, started out as a physical entity because I wanted him to be a Thor-like character. So he was going to be big and a bit sort of blundering. And the exact opposite, it then occurred to me, of what very neat, contained, constrained Helen Firth would ever go for. And then I love the idea of them having known each other as children, basically as adolescents, in which he had tentatively tried to ask her out, and she had absolutely flattened him. And the idea that they would have developed over the years in ways that were kind of true to the adolescents they were, but at the same time, he, who had always, secretly enjoyed poetry, he had never looked like an intellectual, but actually had a very good and interesting mind, and also, knew how to laugh at her. Yeah. These were the things that Helen had never given way to anybody or to any emotion, really, since the experience she'd had with her father at an early age. I don't know. It just came to me. I suppose they came as I was writing, and then I've got used to 25 drafts now. Frankly, you go back, you revise again, and bring these things out. And the character of Helen's father is interesting because I don't have any direct experience of mental health problems of the sort that he clearly had. I imagined that, really, but for his person and the kind of man teacher that he was to Helen on his good days, I drew on my own father for that, because it's what he looked like. I always remember him as a young man, blonde haired, always with a cigarette in his hand, striding up and down when he took us to Iceland, me and my sister, when I was about 13. And he would take us round the saga sites where the historic Icelandic sagas had taken place. And he would just stride about telling stories. And I would be in seventh heaven just listening to him. And so that went into Helen's experience of her father. But then, I brought in a darker side, which I have to stress very strongly was not drawn from my own father. But you never know where these things come from. You just... I was always a bit suspicious of this idea that there's a kind of mystical muse sort of aspect to writing, and that the characters would take you over. But actually, I think when you get into them, you begin to know who they are, and then they begin to do things that you hadn't quite planned when you sat down at your desk, and that then affects another character, and to make that work, you need to maybe change something there, and it's great. It's great fun.
And then the whole world is created. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's a fabulous book. It made me laugh. It made me cry, like sometimes kind of within a couple of pages. And and it's really kind of thought-provoking as well. And I really enjoyed it. So thank you. I think it's going to be a big hit.
Thank you. I think what delights me in your response is that you laughed and cried, because I wanted it to be, you don't write a story about the queen of the underworld if you're not going to explore death. But I wanted it to be a joyous book.
It's bittersweet.
Yes. Death and dying and that awful side of the human condition is never going to be anything other than sad. But the living before it is what matters, and what Helen Firth had to discover in the book. So if you've caught a sense of happiness as well as sadness, that's wonderful.
It's just like the figure of Hel herself, like you say, she kind of encompasses kind of the whole of life and humanity, the darkness and the light. And I think, the whole book does capture the spirit of Hel. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking to Sally. I found her move to fiction later in life really inspiring and encouraging, actually. I think in our culture that fetishizes youth and the whole young prodigy narrative, it's really important to remind ourselves that there is time, that there isn't an expiry date on creativity. Sally clearly always had a need to tell stories and to write to make sense of the world, which she kept going through a big career in broadcasting, 5 kids, aging parents, life, until she had more of herself to devote to it. I love the bit when she talks about taking that imaginary leap to inhabit the characters and realising that yes, she can do this. What struck me speaking to Sally is that our creativity and our voice evolve as we do over the course of our lives, that there is a depth that comes with lived experience and also this sense of ongoing discovery. I don't know about you, but I find that exciting. Thank you for listening to this episode of How You Find Your Voice. If you enjoyed it, please do share it with a friend, rate it and leave a review, but only if it's 5-star. Only joking. Until next time.